Hi and welcome to another story, and today we have part 10 of The Runaway Girls by Jacqueline Wilson, continuing from chapter 16. The desk sergeant took us into a bleak little room with 2 hard chairs and a table. "Here, you can stay in my interview room for now," he said. "Oh, thank you very much indeed, desk sergeant, sir," I said, though he was hardly offering us luxury accommodation. We sat on the chairs and Kitty watched hopefully as he marched out of the room. But then we heard the key turning outside, locking us in. She put her head on the table and started sobbing. "Oh, Kitty, don't. I just said you were my maid on the spur of the moment. I didn't mean to upset you," I said. "I'm not crying about that," said Kitty, wiping her eyes and her nose with the back of her hand. "Is it because I told that horrid sergeant where I lived? I was just trying to find a way of getting them to release us. I'm sure Papa won't mind paying a fine. I think he's very rich," I said. "He won't pay a fine for me too," Kitty sniffed. "Yes, he will," I insisted. But I could see Papa might be likely to blame Kitty. Maybe he wouldn't pay for her. "But if he won't, then I will take money from home, or go out and perform all by myself until I have enough money to free you," I said. I expected her to be impressed, but she shook her head wearily. "I won't be here. They'll have carted me off to the beak and sentenced me, and then I'll be in prison," said Kitty. "Then I'll stay with you wherever Papa pays the fine or not, and we'll both go to prison, and no matter what it's like, at least we'll be together," I said stoutly, though inside I was quavering. We sat there on the hard chairs for hours and hours. The desk sergeant brought us a morsel of old cheese, a small chunk of bread, and a tin mug of water for our dinner. "Is this for the 2 of us to share?" I asked, when he'd gone. "It's not very much." "I dare say those other folk in the big cell won't be getting anything at all," said Kitty. "Then let's pretend it's a wondrous feast," I said. "Pray, try this fine portion of peacock, Princess Kitty." "You can't eat peacocks, you noodle," said Kitty, but it made her smile. "Very well, may I help you to this sweet barley sugar twist," she said, offering me a crust of bread. "Let us wash it down with our fine wine," I said, taking a sip of water. "Delicious," said Kitty, taking her turn to sip. "Oh my, it's gone straight to my head. I'm drunk, look." She slid off her seat and staggered round the room, playing the fool. I copied her, and we swayed about, bumping into each other, laughing hysterically. "We'd better stop this, or they'll lock us up in the madhouse instead of prison. And they say it's even worse in there," said Kitty. "Do you think the desk sergeant really has sent someone to tell Papa?" I asked. Kitty shrugged. "Maybe. He seems to like you. Everyone does." "No one really liked me at home," I said. "I'm sure my new mother secretly detested me, and Miss Groan was very strict and irritable all the time. And I don't even think Papa cared for me very much, though fathers are meant to love their children, aren't they?" "Gaffer loved me immensely, and he wasn't even my father," said Kitty. Nurse wasn't family neither, I thought, but I knew she loved me immensely too. I felt a sudden pain in my chest because I still missed her so much. Was she missing me badly too? Or was she settled down in her country cottage now, tending the roses round the door and eating the beans from her vegetable patch? Did she spend every evening rocking comfortably in her chair with a stray cat on her lap? Or would she have to find another job? Perhaps she was in another nursery now, cuddling some other child and calling it her own little darling. I felt a stab of such jealousy that I clutched my chest. "Have you got a pain, Lucy?" Kitty asked anxiously. "No, it's just because I'm missing her so much," I mumbled. "Mrs. Chubb," Kitty asked, "if it wasn't for me, you could still be with her and be her little girl and live happily ever after. You're thinking this, and yet you're too kind to blame me and say it's all my fault." "No, it's not Mrs. Chubb," I said. "I liked her at first, but not when she started plotting against you. We were only with her a few days anyway, not enough to really care about her." "We've only been together a few days, too," said Kitty. "But it feels as if we've known each other for years, and years, you know it does. I love you best in the whole world, apart from Nurse," I told her. "She's the one I'm missing." Kitty bent her head. "I love you best in the whole world, apart from Gaffer," she said. We pushed the 2 chairs together so that we could hold hands comfortably as we sat. And sat, and sat, and sat. We sometimes heard the cell door clanging as prisoners were pushed inside. Someone started screaming and didn't stop. Someone else started hitting the wall repeatedly, over and over again. "I do hope that little boy's all right. They won't really put him in prison, will they?" "They could, and they could put us in prison too. It don't look like your Papa is coming with that fine, does it?" said Kitty. But at last the desk sergeant came back into the room. He stood there, hands on his hips, his big stomach straining the brass buttons on his navy tunic. I smiled at him cravenly, but he didn't smile back. "Don't you flutter your eyelashes at me, you scheming little minx," he said. "My young runners just reported back to me. I know the whole truth now." I don't know what you mean," I quavered. "What did Papa say?" Your pa's away on business, but my boy spoke to your so-called mother, said the desk sergeant. She's not my real mother, I protested. Exactly. The good lady said that your pa had a little girl once, but she'd run away from home, he said. Yes, that's me, I cried. Oh no, that poor little girl has never been seen since. They've sent out search parties and advertised in the newspapers, but now they feel she's lost forever. Only the other day another girl turned up at the doorstep, an impudent ragged urchin who claimed she was their daughter, and she had an accomplice with her, a dark curly-haired street child with barely a stitch on. He pointed at Kitty. Yes, that was us, but I'm sure she knew it was me. She hates me and was glad to see the back of me, I said. Papa didn't recognise me then because I was so dirty and was wearing dreadful rags. My frock, Kitty interrupted indignantly. But he'd know me now I'm decently dressed, and although I dare say he's still very vexed with me, I know he'd pay the fine. Desk sergeant, sir, I said. You're expecting me to believe your father didn't recognise his own flesh and blood? He said incredulously. You're a clever little liar, but that's much too far-fetched. Indeed, sir, it isn't. I swear I'm telling the truth, and Papa mistook me for another child when we were at the seaside together several months ago, I said. He does not see very clearly, I continued, because it was so humiliating having to admit that my sharp-sighted Papa was so disinterested in me that he'd simply failed to recognise me. But the desk sergeant was shaking his head at me. The lies that come flowing out of those rosy little lips. You need a good birching to teach you a lesson, he declared, and I dare say you'll get one where you're going. We're going to prison? Kitty asked. It would do you both good, but there's been such a multitude of felonies today that we've had word that the courts can't deal with any more tomorrow, so you two are in luck, he said. You're letting us go? Oh, thank you, Mr. Desk Sergeant, sir, I began fervently, but he was shaking his head incredulously. You can't think I'm letting you waltz out of here scot-free. I can't send you home, because it seems clear you ain't got one. So, you're going to a place where you'll be looked after, he said. The workhouse, said Kitty. The workhouse, I echoed. I didn't know anything about workhouses and what happened there, just that they were very bleak places for very poor people. You can't send us there, Kitty insisted. Oh, yes, I can, said the desk sergeant, enjoying himself. Come on, up you get. Your carriage awaits, young ladies. But we're too little. We're not 9 yet. I'm only 7 and Lucy is rising 8, Kitty gabbled. I stared at her. I knew she had no idea how old she was, and she knew I was 9. I dare say they'll make suitable provision for you. It's up to them. Come along. Let's be having you, he said, seizing us both by our wrists and pulling us towards the door. There was no point struggling. He had us in an iron grip, and then a horrible burly gentleman in a fancy uniform took over. He seemed to have the strength of Mr. Marvel, because he tucked us under each arm as if we were piglets, and deposited us in the large open cart waiting outside the police station. There were handcuffs bolted to the wood inside the cart, and we were firmly attached by one wrist. The boy was caught there too, and the weeping woman, and several bold girls with face paint, and an old man with a long beard who stared in front of himself blankly, out of his wits. The burly man got up in the driver's seat and took up his reins. His old thin horse tried to bend his head in protest, but the man gave him a sharp flick with his whip. The horse lumbered forward wearily. Did you see him whip that poor horse? I said indignantly to Kitty. Shh now, or he'll whip you too, Kitty whispered. Why did you say I was rising 8 when I'm not? And I'm sure you're much older than 7, even though you're so little, I whispered back. You're supposed to be 9 or older before you're put in the workhouse. Gaffer always said they're terrible places. You have to pick oakum, Kitty said. What's that? It's some sort of old rope, and you have to unpick all the strands, said Kitty. I don't think that sounds too bad. I quite like unpicking things, I said. I had once pulled the end of my woolen muffler and felt a wicked delight in unravelling an inch or so. You have to sit still on a hard bench with all the other inmates for 12 hours a day and pick it until your hands bleed, Kitty whispered darkly. Well, we'll have to make sure we sit next to each other, and then we can play our pretend games, I said. You're not allowed to say a single word. You get severely punished if you do, Kitty hissed. I wasn't sure I wanted to ask what kind of punishment. I imagined various dreadful possibilities as we were driven along at a snail's pace. All the poor horse could manage. This was punishment too, because the crowds drifting away from the great exhibition all stared and pointed, and some rough boys actually threw stones at us. It grew worse when we were out of the park and driving along the main thoroughfare. It was dreadfully crowded, and we felt very small and vulnerable in the midst of great omnibuses and grand carriages, with every eye upon us. Some people exclaimed in horror, "Oh, dear heavens, look at those wretched souls!" Some recoiled, "Avert your head at once, you don't want to see such dreadful folk." Some looked and said, "Poor devils, what a motley crew." See the handcuffs, even on the little children. Surely they're not all destined for the workhouse. We were driven across a great bridge over the Thames, where the streets were smaller, the buildings were decrepit, the poor people poorer. We didn't attract so much attention here. Then we turned into a cobbled street that made us bounce in the cart, and as we were joggled up and down, we saw a large bleak brick building along the way. We didn't need to be told. We were approaching the workhouse. The burly man jumped down from his driver's seat and rapped sharply at the formidable door. Another man in uniform appeared, and between them they seized the women and the very old man, whose knees buckled so they ended up practically carrying him inside. Kitty and I and the small boy were left shackled to the cart, all three of us trembling. Perhaps we can make a bolt for it when that man comes back to undo our cuffs, Kitty suggested. But when the burly man emerged to get back in his seat and whip the horse into action again, he drove us right past the workhouse and around the corner to a low red brick building with a name carved into the plaster above the door, Junior House of Correction. I wasn't sure what that meant. Miss Groan had corrected all my lessons, scratching rueful comments in the margins of my workbooks. So was this some kind of school? Perhaps we would do lessons all day, although they could be boring. At least they weren't as tedious as picking oakum all day long. And I might shine. Miss Groan had despaired of my arithmetic and general knowledge, but she'd acknowledged that I was a very good reader, and my compositions were well written, if a little fanciful. The burly man rapped at the door, and an enormous woman answered it. She had to turn sideways to step outside, and took a look at us. Mrs. Chubb had been well covered. Nurse had been plump, but this person seemed practically the size of the stuffed elephant at the exhibition. She wore a black bombazine frock that strained at every seam, and a white apron large enough to sail a boat. She had a white cap on her head, with a few sparse ringlets dangling around her ears, as if she was still a young girl. She dimpled at the burly man in a flirtatious manner. "Why, Mr. Barrow, what have you bought for me today?" she said, rubbing her swollen hands as if she were expecting presents. "2 girl thieves, and a surely young pickpocket," the burly man said, gesturing at us. "We're not thieves," Kitty said through gritted teeth. "That's one very wild," said Mr. Barrow. "I'd keep your eye on her especially." "I keep my eyes on all my little charges, don't you fret," she said. They were very small eyes, sunken down into her face, but she battered her eyelids and dimpled all the more. "Release the little chicks, and bring them indoors, if you please." Together they herded us through the door, down a dark corridor, and into a very large room set with a long table and bench. Children sat stiffly side by side along each bench, some so small that they had to be tied into position to stop sliding underneath. They looked like one enormous plain family, because they all had brutally short haircuts and ill-fitting grey uniforms. There was a terrible stench of damp dish rags and unwashed bodies, and an overwhelming sour milk smell wafted from a collection of tureens on a table at the end. There were many tin bowls and spoons, and a strange wooden trough that didn't seem to have any purpose. Did they keep an animal in this nightmare dwelling? The huge woman dallied with Mr. Barrow, while the children in the room stared at us newcomers. A few little ones fidgeted and whimpered, but the others were weirdly silent, glancing every now and then at the great bulk of bombazine. Kitty tried poking her tongue out at one of the boys on the front bench. He blinked in alarm, but didn't pull a face back. Then the 2 adults said their farewells, and the elephantine woman glided over to us, surprisingly light on her feet, her hem swaying as she walked. "I am Mrs. Turnover, the matron of this fine establishment. I'm sure you will benefit from your time here, so long as you keep quiet, work hard, and pay attention at all times," she said in a girlish little voice, smiling. Then she suddenly thrust her head nearer and shouted, "So what is my name, children?" It was such a shock that I could barely stutter. "Mrs. Turnover?" Mercifully, Kitty and the small boy managed to mumble it too. "That is correct. Well remembered," she said, softly now. "So, tell me your names, chickies. Boy first." "Bertie Woodfield," he said. "Bertie Woodfield what?" Mrs. Turnover demanded. "There ain't another bit," said poor Bertie, mystified. "You should say, Bertie Woodfield, Mrs. Turnover," she shouted at him. "So say it." He had to gabble it 5 times before she was satisfied. "Enough." She turned to me. "First girl. Name?" "Lucy Alice May Browning, Mrs. Turnover," I said, and I bobbed her a little curtsy, though my legs were trembling so much I very nearly fell over. "Lucy Alice May Browning, Mrs. Turnover," she said, in a cruel, childish mimic of my voice. "Oh my, who have we here?" I didn't know if she was asking a question or making a statement. I repeated my name in a whisper. "What's that? Speak up!" Mrs. Turnover commanded, putting her hand to her ear in a pantomime of deafness. My mouth was so dry I could hardly stammer it out a third time. "And who exactly are you, Lucy Alice May Browning?" she said, clasping her hands over her enormous open stomach. I know who she was. She was the most hateful woman in the world, and no wonder every child in the room was cowed into silence. "I am a little girl, Mrs. Turnover, falsely arrested," I said. "A little lady, with big blue eyes and dulcet tones. Oh my, we're lucky to have you here in my little nursery workhouse. Falsely arrested, are you? Oh, such a shame. And you expect me to beat my breast at the injustice?" she asked. No, Mrs. Turnover," I murmured. "You don't belong here, do you, little Lady Lucy?" "Not really, Mrs. Turnover," I said in a mouse squeak. "I haven't done anything wrong, and neither has my friend here. We haven't stolen anything. A wicked man stole from us." "Such brazen lies! And you are a little lady. You must be especially wicked and depraved to end up in this situation when you've had every advantage. It's clear you were once used to a privileged life. A wealthy papa, a mamma clad in silks and satins, maids running in to please her every whim, whilst you got pampered by your nurse and governess." Mrs. Turnover gave a contemptuous sniff. "So, I take it you'll be expecting me to bow and scrape and curtsy to you, your little ladyship." No, Mrs. Turnover, not at all," I said. "Ha! She thinks I meant it," she declared to the room of children, and they tittered nervously. "But she's very much mistaken, isn't she?" "Yes, Mrs. Turnover," they chanted bleakly. "You will do the bowing and scraping and curtsying, little Lady Lucy Alice May Browning, and if you fail to please me, I will have to introduce you to my little friend," she said, nodding towards the corner of the room by the door. I couldn't see anyone standing there at all. Then I realised what she meant. There was a walking stick propped up in the corner, very sturdy and well polished. The room seemed to be spinning around me now, but the stick stayed sharply in focus, looking ever more menacing. I wondered if Mrs. Turnover meant I should literally start bowing and scraping and curtsying. I knew how to bow, I knew how to curtsy even if I wobbled, but how on earth would I demonstrate scraping? Should I prostrate myself on the floor and pretend great deference? But before I could attempt such a terrible task, Mrs. Turnover had started interrogating Kitty, seemingly forgetting all about me. "Second girl, or are you perhaps second boy, seeing as you're dressed so outlandishly in velvet bloomers?" she said, pointing at her mockingly. I prayed Kitty wouldn't give her any cheek. It would be madness to defy such a terrible woman. I was beginning to wish I'd told my true age earlier to the desk sergeant. I would sooner pick oakum 12 hours a day and 12 hours a night than stay here in the junior house of correction. Kitty stood up straight. "I am a girl, Mrs. Turnover. I am wearing this outfit because I am a street performer." She said it proudly, her chin up. Mrs. Turnover's tiny eyes gleamed. "Oh, pray enlighten me, girl. What exactly do you do when you are performing in the street?" "I sing, Mrs. Turnover, and I tumble." "Aha! Well, I dare say you will have the opportunity to do both in this establishment. You will sing loudly when my little friend warms your back during the day, and if I catch you out of your bed at night, then I will set you tumbling all the way down the stairs. Do I make myself plain, second girl?" "Yes, Mrs. Turnover," said Kitty, her fists clenched. "So, what is your name? I dare say it is something outlandish and theatrical," she said disdainfully. "It is simple, Mrs. Turnover. I am Kitty," said Kitty. "Kitty! Every child has a surname." "I'm afraid I don't," said Kitty. "Then you shall be called, let me see, what would suit you? Kitty Uglyface. Do you think that's a fine surname for the little wretch, children?" They sniggered obediently and nodded. "Then Kitty Uglyface you are, from this moment on, and I shall take great pains to tell your name to the beadle of the adult workhouse when you progress there," Mrs. Turnover threatened. "It's a name you'll never forget. Or have you forgotten it already? What's your full name, second girl?" Kitty's face was as red as her velvet costume. I was terrified she'd say something defiantly rude and end up getting beaten half to death. But common sense prevailed. "I'm Kitty Uglyface, Mrs. Turnover," she said in monotone. "Kitty Uglyface," Mrs. Turnover repeated. "Did you hear that, children? Kitty Uglyface. What kind of a name is that? It's very comical, isn't it?" There was forced laughter. Kitty grew even redder. I burned for her. I stood alongside her while Mrs. Turnover had her fill of fun. Then she suddenly stopped the goading and glared around the room. "What's this? Why aren't you eating your lovely supper? Your porridge will be cold by now, you naughty children," she said, and stomped to the serving table where the tureens were. They had stopped steaming. Mrs. Turnover shouted, "First row!" and the children stood in line and shuffled forward. Each was given a ladle worth of porridge in a tin bowl. It smelled terrible, and it looked terrible too, but the children started eating it quickly, even scraping their bowls. I didn't know if they were half-starved or terrified of causing offence. "You 3 new inmates, Bertie Woodfield, Lucy Alice May Browning and Kitty Uglyface. Come and get your nourishing supper, and then sit on the front row where I can keep an eye on you," Mrs. Turnover commanded. We were given our portions and tried hard to fit into the first row. The other children squeezed up as best they could, but the 3 of us were woefully squashed at one end. The porridge was even worse than I'd imagined. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to the dish I'd been served every morning at home. It was thin, grey, slimy stuff with a rancid reek. I tried the tiniest taste. It was barely lukewarm and coated my tongue. I did my best to swallow it down, but a lump made me retch. Mrs. Turnover was watching me with her horrid hawk eyes. "Don't you care for your porridge, Lady Lucy?" she asked, putting on her little girl voice. It's very good, thank you, Mrs. Turnover, though I'm not actually very hungry," I said. "Perhaps it needs a little seasoning," she said. "Do you like sugar on your porridge, child?" "Yes, Mrs. Turnover," I said. "However, I hear the Scots put salt on their porridge. Shall I fetch the salt shaker and see if you can make it tastier to tempt your appetite?" she said, eyes gleaming. I imagined her shaking salt over my bowl until it was snow white, and then commanding me to eat it up. "I think the porridge is perfectly pleasant as it is, Mrs. Turnover," I said, and I forced myself to take another spoonful. I had to tighten my stomach to stop myself bringing it right up again. Mrs. Turnover took her eyes off me while she supervised the bowl filling of the second, third and fourth rows. Bertie Woodfield ate his own porridge, though he pulled a few faces. Kitty ate hers too, surprisingly rapidly. When Mrs. Turnover was busy scolding an unkempt girl, Kitty swapped my full bowl for her empty one and ate mine too. She bolted her second bowlful, her eyes watering, but she managed to get it all down for me. I reached for her hand under the table and squeezed it hard, overcome with gratitude. I had a quick glance around. The children were all eating, except for 4 children at the back, who didn't have a place on any bench or a porridge bowl either. They were standing still, looking wretched. When all the rows had been served, Mrs. Turnover peered at them. She tapped her serving ladle on the tureen. "Your turn to be fed, animals," she called. The 4 children shuffled forward, heads bent. Kitty turned to the girl on the other side. "Why does she call them animals?" she hissed. "Because they wet the bed," the girl whispered back. Mrs. Turnover scraped the contents of the last ladle into the wooden trough. "Feeding time," she said. The 4 children all knelt and then put their heads into the trough and had to gobble the porridge as best they could. We watched in horror. When they were allowed to take their heads out, they had the disgusting porridge all round their mouths, on their cheeks, on their chins, even on their ears. I felt the tears sliding down my face. I felt so sorry for them, and also so scared. When I was little, I had sometimes wet the bed myself, but it was a secret between Nurse and me. It had happened several times when she left, but I had got up very early and bundled my wet sheet into the laundry basket, praying the maid wouldn't tell on me. I would have died if Miss Grove had found out. "Oh, Kitty, what if we wet the bed?" I whispered. "We're not going to," Kitty murmured, "because we're not going to be in bed." "What? We're not staying," said Kitty. She stood up, seized her porridge bowl and hurled it across the room. It went flying through the air and landed smack on Mrs. Turnover's temple, making her stagger. "Quick!" Kitty hissed, seizing my hand. We leapt off our bench and ran helter-skelter for the door. The children gasped in shock. "Run! 2!" Kitty yelled. "Bertie Woodfield, all of you, come with us!" But they stayed glued to their benches, too scared to move. We couldn't wait to encourage them further. We got to the door, but Mrs. Turnover had recovered and was charging towards us, black skirts flying. Kitty seized the little friend walking stick and held it with both hands. Mrs. Turnover rushed at her, and Kitty poked her hard in her enormous stomach. She gasped and then collapsed onto the floor. I got the door open, and we ran hard down the dark corridor. The front door was bolted, but we tugged together and turned the handle hard, wrenching our wrists, getting it open just as Mrs. Turnover came in view, advancing on her knees, screaming threats. We were out of the front door and running with no idea where we were going. I think we would have run into hell itself rather than stay in Mrs. Turnover's junior house of correction. We ran until we couldn't draw breath, and then dodged up an alleyway and leaned against the dank wall, panting. "Oh, Kitty, you were magnificent," I said, when I could speak at last. "That sound she made when she sank to the floor. Oof," said Kitty. She said it again and again, and I did too, and then we both collapsed with laughter, clutching each other to stay upright. Shh now, I gasped. She might still be coming after us. On her knees, said Kitty. Oh, glory, how I wish I could have pushed her horrid head into that awful trough. What a wicked old biddy. She looked so angry. She'll kill us if she catches us, I said. Yes, all she has to do is hurl herself upon us and we'd be squashed flat, said Kitty, laughing. But seriously, what are we going to do? She'll tell the big burly man with the cart he'll come after us. And they'll tell the police too, and they'll all be looking for us, I said, starting to panic. I'll whack them all with my stick, said Kitty, waving it in the air. You wait, they'll all go down like 9 pins. Whack, whack, whack. But there'll be so many of them, and they'll all be furious because we've outwitted them. They'll spread the word to policemen everywhere. 2 girls, one fair in a blue frock, one dark, and wearing red velvet bloomers. Will be pretty obvious. We'll have to find some different clothes, Kitty, I said. I'm not ever wearing anything but my acrobat costume, said Kitty. Well, you look a bit silly when you're an old woman of 50, I said. Oh, Kitty, it's not a joke. It's really scary. They'll catch us in the end. They always do. I know, said Kitty, suddenly serious. She put her hand to her throat in sudden despair. What are we going to do? She whispered. We can't stay around here. We'll have to go far away. Go to the country. Oh, Kitty, we'll go to Sussex and find Nurse. I can't leave London. I told you, said Kitty. But we have to. If we stay, they'll catch us. I know you'll fight and I'll try too, but we're little and they're big, and the police all have truncheons. They'll beat us and lock us up, and maybe, oh Kitty, maybe they'll say you were trying to murder Mrs. Turnover, and then they'll bang you. They'll hang you. I wish I had murdered her, said Kitty. Hateful, hateful, hateful woman. She's the ugly face, not me. She hit the wall hard with the stick, again and again, and then stopped in tears. We have to get right away from London, I persisted. I know, said Kitty, in a very small voice. But tomorrow's Sunday. I need to stay until 8 in the morning, and then we'll try to get to the country. But that's madness. We need to get away now. I have to wait till 8. I must let Gaffer know. Then we'll be off, said Kitty, and I knew there was no way on earth I could make her change her mind. And that is the end of part 10 of The Runaway Girls by Jacqueline Wilson. I'll be back with the final part of this fantastic story very, very soon. If you'd like to subscribe or hit a like, that's always appreciated. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.